You're now listening to Sound Talent Media. Check out more shows at soundtalentmedia.com.
Following the breakup of the Pixies, Kim Deal put all her energy into her side project, The Breeders. Their debut single, Cannonball, supposedly about Pixies singer Frank Black, only peaked at number 44 on the Billboard charts, but has continued to be one of the defining songs of the 90s. This week, we're joined by May guitarist Zach Gehring to decide if The Breeders brought the one-hit thunder or if we are both cuckoo cannonballs for loving them so much.
Crash on the last splash.
One hit is all you need to make the money guaranteed, and you can live off royalties forever. And it makes me wonder, is it just a blunder, or is it one hit thunder?
Hey, Zach, we're going to talk about The Breeders' Cannonball.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk about Cannonball by The Breeders.
Dude, we are around the same age, so we both probably had the same experience. I love where this song takes me. It takes me back to such a cool time, not only like in life, but it was a very angsty time in life. But for music, 1993, 1994, oh man, such a good time, man.
It was a great year. First of all, I want to clarify, I want to confirm. How old are you?
I'm 39.
39. Okay, I'm 38. So we must have both been, 93 was middle school for us, right?
Yeah, eighth, ninth grade, somewhere around there. I remember this song being a buzz clip on MTV.
Okay, yeah, the song came out in August of 93, so that would have been opening of our senior year?
Of middle school.
Oh, yeah. 8th grade, the senior year of middle school.
Yes. Senior year of middle school. Yeah, that's what I always, when I refer to senior year, I'm always talking about senior year of middle school.
8th grade, crazy year.
But dude, could any other time other than like 1993, 1994, could a song like Cannonball be a hit?
Well, that's what I've been thinking on since we decided to do this podcast and we selected a song, just how the 90s environment was in this kind of transitional period, because you had a lot of the indie music and quote unquote underground music kind of coming to the surface and kind of getting some daylight with records like DGC and Geffen. And I think this is a prime example of what was happening in that era. I think another one I always think on is like the Melvins and Stoner Witch. Just listen, that record came out on Atlantic, and I know we're not talking about the Melvins today, but just the way it sounds, it's just one of these things where, and the Breeders' Cannonball, similarly, that would never fly today in any kind of mainstream space. And I think that's what's so amazing about the 90s is that you had this very, very open opportunity for a lot of really rad bands, especially rock bands. I know you and I are rock guys, so it was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, dude, I guess it was probably primarily Nirvana, but probably the entire Seattle kind of surgence of music that kind of opened the door at every major record label to sign such strange bands, such like, and what other time is Ween gonna sign to a major label off of a 4-track recording? And things like that were happening, and that's so cool.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about Butthole Surfers too, because that band was just wild in the 80s, and then when they had mainstream recognition was in the 90s. And that's another thing where you're just like, a band like Butthole Surfers to have mainstream recognition, it just speaks again. Electric Larryland was the record. That was in 96. So it was a little bit later than Cannonball, but still in this era of really rad exploration and alternative music.
Right. And what was crazy too is like now we all know things have changed, minus maybe for like Taylor Swift and people like that. But for the most part, like now, if you're going to do an independent record, you're doing it on a shoestring budget, and you know, you don't have the luxury of getting million-dollar budgets to make albums, and people aren't going to the record store and buying the physical copies of your album, minus some collectible vinyl and stuff like that. But this is still like, that was probably the biggest era for that, because you think of like some of the albums that came out in the 90s that went on to be some of the biggest selling album. Like, for example, Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill is like one of the top selling albums of all time.
I did this, I looked up 1993 albums that were released in 93, same year as Last Splash was released, which is what Cannonball is on, the Breeders record. And it's insane. This list, not only have a fraction of this list, and I focused on rock music, so it's not even getting into hip hop or any other genre, but Tool, Undertow came out, Radiohead's Pablo Honey came out, Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville came out, Counting Crows,
Nice.
August and Everything After Nirvana and Uteros came out, Pearl Jam's Versus came out, Letters to Cleo. I could go on.
Damn, that's so many good ones, even right there already. That's so, you just named like 3 of the most iconic albums, like in my life.
In my life. I mean, that's not even, Fugazi's and On the Kill Taker came out that year. The Cranberries, All's Breaking Things came out. So even the punk rock, more like the scene that was still kind of just underneath this kind of blossoming like alternative rock scene that went mainstream. Yeah, just so many records. A Tribe Called Quest's Midnight Marauders came out. I marked that one just because I'm a big Tribe fan, but it's just a crazy year. And I think, and I was thinking about this, that Cannonball is like an essential type of 90s rock track to me, both in the way it's kind of mixed, the way the song is structured, and the video was directed by Spike Jonze and Kim Gordon. I mean, that's like a picture of a perfect 90s thing.
That is the 90s encapsulated into one song and music video. Like if you wanted to tell somebody what the 90s were like, you could just be like, okay, watch this video. This is what it was like. There was a bowling ball just rolling through the entire 90s. And this is what everything looked like. This is what everyone dressed like.
Exactly. It's like a stylistic snapshot of the 90s, both sonically and like the video and, everything about it. So, and the band was made up of so many heavy hitters. Yeah. Obviously, Kim Deal. On the first record, I think the drummer from Slint was in the band. Just like always, members of very influential indie rock bands that we don't think about when we think about the Breeders necessarily, or I don't. I should speak for myself. But they're all informed and a part of this kind of music group.
Kim Deal, for anyone listening from the Pixies, this might be one of those controversial things to say. I feel like I say a lot of these kind of things on this podcast, but I think I like the Breeders more than I like the Pixies. And I know that's really going out on a limb, but like this album, Last Splash, I don't know if you were like into the album as a whole at the time when it was out, but I loved this album. And it was so almost avant-garde in certain ways. Like there were songs that were almost not songs. They were more like sounds with like talking over them and things like that. I don't know, just such a cool album, and I'm so glad that I was like into this album when I was 13 and 14 years old, because I could have very easily been into like, dude, think about this. We're around the same age. I talked to people about this recently. We were at an influential age for music at a time when music was so cool. But if we were 5 years older, we may have been listening to some bullshit like Whitesnake or something, or some kind of like hair metal. Or if we were 5 years younger, we may have been listening to like the radio rock from the late 90s. Like we may have been like influenced by like Vertical Horizon or something. No, and I'm not talking shit, but like we were very lucky to be surrounded by like people that were taking artistic chances and making wild music, and not just conforming to what was popular at the time.
Yeah, I think it was the early 90s, like we can maybe even go 88, 89, late 80s into early to mid 90s was a very transitional period. You had a new map, like a new territory being developed. And it really didn't last that long. I feel like it burned out, at least in the mainstream sense. I don't know if it's quickly or not when you're speaking of the industry and how fast trends move, but I feel like it's this very specific era of the 90s where this was allowed to happen. And then because it was so, there's like this kind of weird space here where you get really talented artists doing really cool things that sound easy. And by that, I mean, a lot of this stuff sounds like they're just kind of like this kind of hodgepodge, kind of careless approach to creating silly things. And when you get artists on the back end of this era, combined with a very hungry industry, like trying to find the next Nirvana and find the next whatever, you had this wake, the style of music that attempted to continue what was being done in the early 90s, but it was kind of falling short in a lot of ways. And eventually you end up with Creed and Nickelback. And those are easy targets, but I think that's this kind of hangover,
right,
from what was able to be done in a very, very amazing and a meaningful way in the early 90s. So when you think about a band like, obviously the biggest culprit in the Creed sense is going to be Pearl Jam, because Versus came out in 93, and you have this very ungraceful decline in terms of rock music in the late 90s into the 2000s, all on the back of the alternative music scene in the 90s when it kind of like surfaced.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Pearl Jam, because I know you're a big Pearl Jam fan.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what rock bands that followed Pearl Jam that got popular I think the late 90s. Yeah, you brought up Creed and of course Nickelback, the easy targets. But what's crazy is what those bands took away from Pearl Jam wasn't the like wildly inventive songwriting and shit. What they took away from them was
yeah, this vocal styling that was only on like maybe 1.5 records of Pearl Jam's whole discography. A voice that Eddie quickly moved away from.
Right. It's such a shame that that's what came out of this, and not like the crazy like Vitalogy. What a like amazing, like from the songs to the, I don't know, everything about it. The freaking layout of the album.
Yeah.
Is, like everything about it is like incredible, but yet, yeah, that's what we get. That's what we get later is like people trying to knock off the butt rock voice or whatever you want to call that thing. But back to the Breeders and this album, exactly what you were saying is an album like Last Splash sounds like, to the untrained person or someone, like it just sounds like people like having fun in their garage and like doing whatever. But then when I look, and maybe that's what I thought at the time, but now when I look back at that, I'm like, these songs wouldn't be easy to write.
No.
And finding these tones and finding this like the way this like sounds warm, and it sounds like they're getting like these crazy sounds and like, and it sounds lo-fi, but like, okay, if that's easy to do, then go right now, go record something that sounds like that. And you'll find that it's not easy to do that. And what they did was incredible.
Yeah, you wonder, I mean, you and I have both been in the studio in various contexts at various levels of availability of gear, right? So some studios have less gear, some studios have more gear. And you spend time in the studio trying to get a certain tone. And a lot of these tones for us, at least in my experience, has been referenced on the 90s and some of the guitar tones that were achieved in that era. Particularly though, I mean, the Breeders and Cannonball is a great example. The tones are really rad on that record. So you wonder, as much effort as artists do put into finding tones they want in the studio, the way the guitar sounds or the way the drums sound, you know how difficult it is. And you have this kind of really weird category of lo-fi come out. And what does that mean, right? It's you're trying to accomplish something that, at least in terms of how people talk about it, is a product of low budgets, right? But we're in these spaces now trying to mimic these guitar tones that we think of being lo-fi or sounding accidental, sounding like they just put a mic up and got lucky. But I wonder how much they were thinking about that in the time being. I'm looking at the personnel for Last Splash right now, and Kim Deal produced it. This guy named Sean Leonard, who I don't know, was the engineer. as well as Mark Freegard. So, not to get too nerdy, but I'm just looking at this list of personnel, like how much were they involved in achieving these really rad sounds that ended up being on this record. It's crazy. The lo-fi as a category of sound is interesting just because it's spoken about as if it was a result of low budgets, maybe inexperience in the garage, so to speak. But now you have bands post that era that are trying to achieve that sound to the degree that it becomes like this kind of descriptive genre, right?
Right.
And I think that's really interesting to me because now we're trying to spend so much time getting these tones and these sounds that a lot of ways are spoken about as if they're accidental or just kind of on the fly. And I think that's really interesting and how rich these tones coming out of the 90s were in these songs.
Right. And one of the guys, the number one guy I think of who didn't produce this album, but I do believe he produced some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, he produced Pod. Steve Albini. I feel like he is like the guy, like the definition of this. Did you guys didn't record with Steve Albini ever, right?
No, my band Demons thought about it because the cool thing about Steve Albini is that he's super accessible despite doing all these major influential records. You can still just, as long as he's free, he's going to go up to his space in Chicago and record you.
Yeah, he doesn't take points and all that kind of stuff. He's crazy. My buddy Scott, he plays in the band Zayo. And we play together in this band Pack. But Zayo recorded with Steve Albini, and he told me all about it and how awesome it was. And, but even when he talks about it, which I'm not going to I'll let him come on here and talk about it sometime. But basically the point was it was a no frills type experience. It was like what you'd expect. You're playing live. You're not fucking around, like things like you and I are probably used to a lot of times in the studio, like making sure everything is perfect or whatever, which I with Punchline, and I'm sure with May too, try not to do that these days. I feel like maybe 15, 20 years ago, you're always trying to make everything as perfect as possible. But then you start to realize a little later on that like, okay, if it sounds too perfect, then it's going to sound like a processed thing, and it's going to lose all of its actual feeling and life. And you kind of, I should have listened to Last Splash when I was a kid. I should have known that. I should have known that from the start, that like an album's going to be way cooler if you don't go overboard with making it perfect in air quotes.
Well, I think we could talk forever on a different episode or what have you about philosophies around recording, right? Obviously, Steve Albini has a very direct and intentional approach to recording that some people talk about as being philosophical, but he just does these recordings, right? And you have the other end of the spectrum in which you can kind of go in and use all the tools at your disposal, which I'm totally fine with, depending on the project, So I think, they did Pod with Steve Albini. The Breeders did their first record, Pod, and that's the one record that Steve Albini speaks of fondly. Now, speaking about like records he's done that have been really meaningful for him, was his first Breeders record called Pod. I know Kurt Cobain speaks very, very highly of this record as being influential to what they were doing. So for this band to influence and be a part of this movement so much, or to such a meaningful degree, only to have this kind of, because this is a podcast about kind of one-hit wonders. So that here's this band that was so involved in the cultural movement, but still, like so many other bands that were in that same place, only got kind of one quote-unquote hit from this era for them.
Right. And I do want to note real quick that one hit isn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of these bands, even some of the bands that got the big deals and whatever, don't have a hit. So like it's very cool that the Breeders could have very easily been a successful indie rock, more of like underground, even though they were signed to a major label at that point or whatever, that they could have not had a hit, but Cannonball is a hit. That album, Last Splash, went platinum. That means they sold 1 million copies of Last Splash, which is such a, strange album to do that, but it's so awesome that it did. To talk a little bit, to kind of focus the conversation on Last Splash and, more specifically, Cannonball a little bit. Last Splash is almost like Cannonball is almost like the title track of the album, because the album's title comes from the song.
Yeah.
And I say this all the time. I'm a big fan of bands and music where that artist or that band, nothing else sounds like them. If I don't know anything else that sounds like the Breeders. I mean, maybe they sound a little bit like the Pixies because you have have a member of the band, but like I actually prefer the Breeders in that same kind of world, I suppose. But Cannonball, I'm a bassist, so of course I'm like, oh,
dude,
man,
like that carries the song in such a rad way. The bass line.
Oh, so good, so iconic. That is like the bass line of the 90s.
That, I'll say, that is a bass line, that one of the most iconic bass lines of the 90s, one of the most immediately recognizable bass lines that you hear from the 90s. Along with Space Hogs in the meantime.
Yeah, man, we talked about that. Such a good bass line. Hey, I will also, I got to throw one more in there as a bassist. Flea's bass line from Soul to Squeeze is one of my favorites.
That's my favorite Red Hot Chili Pepper song of all time.
Oh, dude, so mine too.
But okay, so speaking of how the industry, we mentioned earlier in the podcast how things are so different nowadays in terms of how people listen to music and how people create music compared to the 90s. You mentioned also that this record, Last Splash, went platinum. And for a record that went platinum, it peaked at 33 on the US Billboard chart, and the record went platinum. So I think that's kind of wild.
Yeah.
That a record that did that well selling in the United States didn't peak higher than 33. I think that speaks a lot to how successful the music industry in general was, how many records people were selling. And the single Cannonball was number 39 in the top 40 mainstream at peak position, and number 2 on the modern rock tracks. So it did really well as a modern rock track.
I mean, that's crazy because, yeah, I mean, that is almost, it's almost like borderline whether it's even considered a hit. It kind of depends on who you ask. To us, it is absolutely a hit, and it is obviously the Breeders' biggest song. And it was on MTV, and it was not just MTV, but like think about how, I don't know if you were like me back then, but I taped. Every Sunday night I taped 120 minutes. And so I could watch it on Monday after school because, I couldn't really stay up from midnight till 2 a.m. On Sunday nights. But I mean, the Breeders were a staple on that, and not just Cannonball. Were you into the album as a whole, or were they kind of on your radar, but not like, I mean, a lot of bands were like that for me. So it's not.
Yeah, they're in my periphery, right? So to speak for myself, I was a Pearl Jam kid. I was a grunge kid in the 90s, right? In middle school. So for me, like 6th grade and 7th grade is where I really came in to my own kind of forming my own opinions about what I liked musically. And Pearl Jam was at the top of that list. So for someone who had limited access to that world, like it was all this kind of like Pearl Jam and Pearl Jam's Watershed, right?
Right.
So in 8th grade, I started getting more into punk rock. And when I started getting more into punk rock, I became more reactionary for a number of reasons. So I'd kind of stay away from stuff that was, I was just more interested in finding out punk rock music. And so like 93, that transition from 8th to 9th grade or whatever, I was kind of deeper into that space where I was learning, I was more interested in like finding about NoFX and Rancid.
Right. Dude, we are like, you and I had like the same exact trajectory of like, we should have been, I feel like like this stuff, and not necessarily the Breeders, but like the entire world of music, we should have been celebrating the fact that it was like, that it was popular, but then I almost got too cool for it.
No, I mean, I missed out on so many great bands in the 90s that were live and active because I was so hell-bent on kind of who 7 Seconds was. Like, and I just missed a lot. And I think a lot of that has to do with who I was hanging out with, who I wanted to be in with. When you're a kid that age, you're super impressionable. Everything's awful. Everything's great. And so you're just trying your best to tread water. And I think my attachment to punk rock and my kind of eschewing of alternative music and the more broad alternative scene was a result more of just me trying to like figure things out socially. That being said, I found a lot of great punk music, but I missed out on a lot of great quote unquote alternative indie music.
Right. And you know, I was into it and shaped by it, influenced it by it, but as I saw it become so popular, I needed to have something that was like a little more underground so I could feel cooler. And I got, dude, I'll never forget. I still remember it. I remember going to like a used CD place, selling all my like Nirvana and like everybody, all these like iconic albums, selling them for like whatever, $2 or $3 a piece, so I could buy CDs from like
Guttermouth,
the Lookout Records catalog. Yeah, like yeah, exactly. Dude, I'm not even kidding. Guttermouth may have that Friendly People album, I think it's called. That may have been one of the CDs I bought. But yeah, exactly. I wanted to get Lookout Records. I wanted to get Fat Records. I wanted to get Epitaph, and I wanted to get whatever, Doctor Strange, and then we won't even get into a few years later when I had to have every ska album. But you know that's just so crazy when you're that age and like you can't see past the, oh, this lame person in my class is wearing a Nirvana shirt, so I'm gonna get rid of these CDs now. But anyway, yeah, the Breeders, I actually kept my Breeders CD
because you liked it.
They weren't. Yeah, I liked it, and I still like it. That, I don't know if you're familiar. Do you know the song Divine Hammer?
I listened to it recently on the playlist that was circulated, and
I love that song.
Focused on it because you said you liked it so much.
It's definitely, it sounds like it's recorded in another room or something. Like the way it's recorded is so strange because it sounds very lo-fi, but it's so catchy. And oh man, I love Kim Deal's voice.
Kim Deal's a great voice. I just can't get over that intro. That like in the video, you know, when they show her in the water, from the kind of like a beat under the water. Just for a shot that I remember like distinctly through all my years. Like when that's another thing about the video that made it stand out, at least for me. I guess to Spike Jonze's and Kim Gordon's credit, there were these shots that were just kind of like burned into my memory. And the opening of that video being one of those shots where they're in the water and the bubbles are coming out of their mouth and they're going, ooh, like that's so cool.
Yeah. It's so awesome, man. Spike, dude, what would you get? I would give anything to make a music video with Spike Jonze.
I would give a lot. That's for sure.
I know. Dude, you know what's crazy too? I don't know. Maybe May has. I know Punchline never has, but have you ever thought about like hitting him up?
No.
I mean, that's what's funny is like, you never know. Like he did do a lot of like, you know, he's probably not he probably doesn't even want to do music videos anymore or whatever. Yeah. But like, you never, like a lot of things in life, like I'm like, well, I never asked.
Yeah.
I never like made an effort to like make that happen. I'm just like, oh no, there's no way that could ever happen. But like, you know, that's what's kind of wild is like, I don't know. May's a pretty big band, man. You guys are pretty popular. Do you ever think of like reaching out to Spike Jonze?
You know, Jacob's really into the virtual reality world. So maybe if he can kind of like hit Spike Jonze up with a very creative idea that would interest Spike Jonze at this point in his career after he's done so much revolutionary work, you know, who knows? I'll talk to Jacob about it. Maybe in a year and a half or so, you'll see a May video directed by Spike Jonze and Jacob Marshall. Would be rad. You know, on that topic of creative people coming up in the 90s, I wish we talked about like our age range, how we were kind of in this very impressionable age at a very important time in music. What if I was like a few years older though, and I was like a college kid in the Northeast in like in 1992? That's something I fantasize a lot about, just being in the music scene as a college student at like NYU or Brown or something, you know, predictable like that, you know, unoriginal. Just being this person, seeing these shows like the Pixies and the Breeders and Nirvana and Alice in Chains and, you know, you name it, come through in these very kind of small club levels. I don't know. I fantasize about that a lot. I just think back, you know? Yeah,
it's wild. It's wild to think of, who people saw as if they like, I think about the fact there's this dude in Pittsburgh who he's just like this eccentric promoter who's been promoting shows forever. His name's Manny. And he, like, if you're from Pittsburgh and you play music, you know who Manny is. Mm-hmm. He's just this wild, like, character who's brought in every band that you could, but like the most obscure bands before they were huge. And it's always some kind of terrible story about how like, Modest Mouse played at this whatever, this rundown place, and then they were pissed because they didn't pay him enough, so they threw a brick through his window, or Nirvana slept on his couch and blah, blah, all this kind of like wild ass stories. But in Pittsburgh, he's like the dude that's probably seen every band when they were playing in front of 10 people and brought them in. I'm sure that he was at his doing the most shows ever at that time when things were just like every band was just popping off because there was this boom of signing every band, probably every band that Kurt Cobain had something to say about, because the Breeders, like that Kurt Cobain loved Pod, and there's no way that didn't help. I mean, the fact that Kim Deal was in the Pixies probably helped. But look at Daniel Johnston. All it took was Kurt Cobain wearing a Daniel Johnston t-shirt, and that probably increased Daniel Johnston's record sales by 1,000.
Yeah, just a mention or a shirt wear is going to do it if it's Kurt Cobain doing the wearing.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. It's a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.
What's up, everybody? I am Finn McKenty, host of the Punk Rock NBA podcast, part of the Sound Talent Media Podcast Network. My podcast is all about doing what you love for a living, and every week I sit down and talk to people who have done exactly that. For example, musicians like Tommy from Between the Buried and Me, Matt from Periphery, Lil Lotus and Shinigami, among many others, photographers, artists, designers, YouTubers like Glenn Fricker and Sarah Dici, and I unpack exactly how they got to where they are today with the goal of helping you do the same. So if that sounds cool, you can listen and subscribe at soundtalentmedia.com, and I'll see you there.
Let's talk about the lyrics of this song.
Yeah, let's
Another
talk about
thing that is, in my mind, like I said, is a quintessential 90s song, and I think the lyrics as well fit to this kind of description. I was reading them last night or 2 nights ago, and I'm just like, it's a great launching point to talk about lyrics and why some lyrics that don't seemingly make any sense relate, that we can relate to in a weird way. And I think this is a perfect example of it. So let's go.
A lot of times, when you're in a band and you're talking about lyrics, I know I have a lot of conversations with Steve about this over the years, is like you have this borderline of, do you want the lyrics to hit you over the head and make sense, or do you want the lyrics to be abstract and assign your own meaning to it? And this is a song where you absolutely need to assign your own meaning to this. And, it's want you, cuckoo, cannonball. in the shade, in the shade, in the shade, in the shade. I know you little libertine. I know you're a cannonball. I'll be whatever you want. The bong in this reggae song. Like,
I never knew what she was saying, and I was like, that makes sense that I wouldn't know, because I would never imagine that line to be in this song. The bong in this reggae song. That's so weird.
It's spitting in a wishing well, blown to hell, crash. I'm the last splash.
I'll tell you what. My favorite lyric in this song is going to be either spitting in a wishing well, which is the first line of the song, which is rad. A great image, kind of an angsty 90s type thing, Yep. And I know you're a little libertine. Yeah. Everything else, I'm just like, I know you're a real cuckoo. I mean, that reminds me of the magnetic fields.
Yeah, Belle and Sebastian.
Bella Sebastian, you're correct. You're right on. I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously, I don't want to sensationalize or trivialize the problems that, was it Kelly Deal that had more drug issues? I think that Kim had alcoholism, as well. But I just wonder, these songs kind of speak to this kind of environment as well in the 90s of just kind of like references to at least being a youngster reading about this stuff. They always mention drug references and just being this kind of like haze and writing these lyrics that just only make sense when you're under the influence of something. I don't know. That's just me spitballing, Chris.
Yeah, well, hey, I never thought about it till you just said it. I can't believe I've never thought about this, but spitting in a wishing well is such a good lyric and such a good 90s lyric.
Yeah.
Like that is exactly what I would do as this young punk, where this wishing well where you're supposed to go and throw a coin in and make a wish, but
it's like that scene in the Goonies that's really motivational when they're down underneath in the underground, and they have this
Right.
what character has a really great monologue about like
I'm taking them back.
He made in a wishing well, and he's taking it back and
Taking them all back.
Like, whatever. I'm spitting the wishing well regardless.
I always used to believe that when you threw your money in, it turned into your wish.
You take no coins, and I'll take 2 coins. And
Hey, that's not fair. You might
wait,
all your coins and you don't get any.
Wait, stop. You can't do this.
Why?
Because these are somebody else's wishes. They're somebody else's dreams.
Yeah, but you know what? This one right here. This was my dream, my wish. And it didn't come true. So I'm taking it back. I'm taking them all back.
You may not know this, but I thanks to our producer Matt, I do have, and I researched this. I found out some of what this song's about.
Let's do it.
And it might be interesting to you as a guy. You're into philosophy, and obviously, and you are very into literature and things like that. And I thought this was very interesting. What Kim Deal said about it, I'll read you what she said. She said, as for the song's meaning, it's about Kim Deal's resentment of how she was treated by Frank Black towards the end of the Pixies run, as well as inspired by a biography of, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Is it Marquis De Sade?
It's Marquis De Sade.
De Sade, because that's where I thought maybe it was Sade, because that's where the term sadism comes from, correct?
Yeah, I think because it's French, it's going to be Marquis de Sade. But hey, I'm not trying to say that as an authority. I know it's Marquis because it's French. De Sade, yeah. I believe that's the way you pronounce it. But if anyone's listening, I'm not trying to make a claim on that, but I think that's what it is. Okay, but
I think you're right.
Continue.
So Kim Deal's quote is, "Cannonball is the first single. So this is a good one to tell you about because Last Splash, the title of the album, comes from some of the lyrics in the song. My sister was reading a biography of Marquis de Sade, and I'm making fun of him. I'm saying, oh, you little libertine, you're a real cuckoo. If you want to go to hell, come on, let's go to hell. Don't just jump in, do a cannonball. It's when you tuck your legs up and you make the biggest splash you can. And you know what? I'm going to be right behind you. I'm going to be the last fucking splash. It's a commitment to hell, I guess." Which is so cool. Like I didn't even know do you know who Marquis De Sade is?
Yeah, he's this notoriously, what's the right word? Sinister figure in French history that kind of represented the idea of a libertine, like a complete freedom to the point of abuse.
Yeah, you become sadistic because you have no limits to what you can do because you're wealthy and you have no one could tell you not to do something. So you just do whatever. So basically Trump.
Well, yes, I just won't give that Trump that much credit in terms of meaning, in terms of principle that informs a very abusive type of behavior. French social theorist named Michel Foucault wrote about Marquis de Sade, and also Albert Camus, another French writer, wrote about Marquis de Sade as well. Because he represented this very French idea of liberty, but at the same time, you're right. Like the term sadism comes from what this guy was doing in terms of keeping people chained up. Like people were just entire objects to his own pleasure. They're just kind of a means to an end. However, his end was not rooted in any kind of, goal, teleological purpose. It's just like for the purposes of his amusement. And so the idea here, going back to the song of Kim Deal, now I want to be clear on, did Kelly Deal write this song or was it Kim Deal?
From what I'm getting from Kim Deal's quote, it's Kim Deal at least wrote the lyrics.
Yeah, okay.
Because she's talking about how her sister was reading the book about Marquis de Sade.
Yeah.
And so she wanted to comment on that, I suppose.
The idea that she was kind of like going along, kind of like this kind of like an intentional kind of, okay, let's do it. Let's do it, Marquis. Let's
Yeah,
one
right.
together. I'm going to be right behind you. That's really interesting. And obviously we don't want to speculate, but I mean, to align yourself for Marquis De Sade could be kind of problematic.
Right. Like, so it would kind of be like in the same way that, I mean, because supposedly the guy, it's not supposedly, I think it's a fact. The guy was a pedophile. He was
awful. He was awful.
Yeah, he was an abusive pedophile was what he was. So like, it's kind of problematic in the same way. It's like, okay, I really like the book and the movie Clockwork Orange, but then when you look at it, it's like, why do I like this?
Yeah.
It's interesting, but it's also really fucked up. I don't know. Like, that's a good thing to talk about when it comes to the 90s. I feel like there was a lot of that stuff floating around.
There's a lot of that going around, and I think, another thing about the 90s in relation to now is how certain things were given a green light, given a pass, that wouldn't fly now. I don't think this song would kind of fall into that. I'm not saying you suggest that. I just think, okay, well, the lens that we kind of look through 90s music now is obviously contextualized by, in a positive sense, the raising of certain voices that were marginalized in the 90s, particularly, obviously, women, when it comes to representation of sex and sexism. And I think another thing, we have this band, I think in the 90s as well, you had this kind of thing where so many women are making rad music and kind of coming to the fore and claiming their own ground in this scene that has been so long and still is dominated by men. So you have the Deal Sisters, you have Liz Phair, obviously the White Girl Movement, you have Elastica, a lot of these kind of women that are making really great lasting music that we're still obviously talking about today.
Don't forget about my favorite of all time. This is the era that really birthed the solo career of Björk as well.
Björk, like, in a league of her own.
When it comes to music, when someone asks me who my favorite artist of all time is, I always say Björk, and I even pronounce her name correctly. That's how much I like her.
I'm over here like Björk.
Yeah, that's how. I mean, I feel weird saying it correctly, but at some point, I think the first like I knew that's how you pronounce it, but I always felt like pretentious pronouncing it that way. But then I think it was, do you happen to know Vince Ratty, who was in Zoloft the Rock and Roll Destroyer? He went on, he's a producer. I don't know if you've ever.
I know that we played shows with Zoloft back in the day with Starting Line and Zoloft. They're from Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah. Point being that he's the first person I ever heard like pronounce it normal, even though I knew, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that too. If Vince is doing that, I'm doing that too. But getting away from the point a little bit here, being that, the one other thing I'm going to talk about is she straight up talking about how she was treated poorly by Frank Black, who I guess is a fucking asshole. Because
I've heard, this story and one other story.
Kim, it was a Kim from the Muffs.
Yes, Kim Shattuck, about how she stage dived, and he said, or at least the manager came up to her afterward, or the tour manager, whoever it was, and said, "You can't do that." Those two stories, this one and that one, kind of are at least enough for me to think, okay, Frank Black, what's going on?
Right. I mean, and it could just be, I don't know if you've. I mean, we're not going to name names on this podcast because it'd be so easy for me to do that. But, you meet these people along the way when you're in touring bands. And I will say this, I would say 98.7% of the people that I've toured with over the years have been cool people. And not necessarily everybody is like my best friend, but for the most part, they're pretty cool people. But every once in a while you meet that one where you're like, fuck that guy. and sometimes it's just an asshole, but sometimes that same person is at the same time like a savant in a way.
Yeah.
But maybe sometimes a symptom of that is that you're not necessarily a good person. Yeah. I mean, do you think Kurt Cobain was a good person?
I wonder about this a whole lot. I read a book recently by, who was the manager of Nirvana? I forget his name. He just wrote a book.
I don't know.
It's called Serving the Servant. And he painted Kurt Cobain in a very, very positive light. He also painted Courtney Love in a very, very positive light. After that, I read a book about Mudhoney. And they painted a very different picture of Nirvana. not necessarily a one saying that Kurt Cobain was kind of they weren't criticizing Kurt Cobain, they're just criticizing the Nirvana camp as being kind of, just all trying to protect Nirvana, and because they're making money off Nirvana. All to say, they painted that band in a kind of a critical light. And my last point to this kind of journal story, I apologize, is that when I did read another book about Kurt Cobain, I heard that at one point he was taking 90 or 95% of the publishing royalties from Nirvana songs.
Wow.
Is that a dick move? I think it depends on who you ask and how they think about creativity. I think it's a little excessive considering how important Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic were to the songs. All that said, the jury's out. I'm sorry. I can't.
Right. I mean, did you see his own daughter made that or produced that HBO documentary. I forget what it was called. Something. What's it called? Montage of Heck.
Montage of Heck.
I mean, that didn't paint him in a very good light, and that was his own daughter making that. So I don't know. I mean, obviously she's, it just made him look really bad. Although he was very heavily addicted to drugs. So
yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I can't. Obviously, none of us can like even begin to estimate or guess how crazy his life must have been as this frontman of Nirvana. And I don't want to speak a lot about, people talking about the pressures on certain people in certain positions. I think that's entirely valid. And so how could, who knows how it kind of impacted his personality or his person that was already inflicted by, his own life growing up. So who knows? But he seemed like he was just someone that was trying to kind of negotiate his emotions and his anger in a world that he could do whatever he wanted in,
Right. But, anyway, we could talk about Kurt Cobain forever. We're talking about the Breeders. I'm sure, I always like to think about on this podcast. So there's probably not that many episodes of podcasts about the Breeders out there.
That's a good point.
I'm kind of thinking to myself, like, hey, at some point, maybe Kim Deal will listen to this. She'll go, oh, there's a podcast. And Kim Deal, I apologize if we talked about Nirvana too much on here.
We want to apologize if we're speaking too speculatively. We're obviously going on very limited evidence, but we love the band. We love the song. I listened to a podcast that Kim Deal did with Mark Maron, and she seemed like an amazing, just fun person who just wanted to hang out and talk. I feel like Mark Maron, like, from what I remember, like, she just wanted to talk and hang out about a lot of things. Are you a fan of Mark Maron's podcast? Do you listen to it?
I listen to it a lot. I listen to anytime there's a guest that I care to listen to. I skip the ones where I don't know who the guest is. But
same. But if you haven't heard the Kim Deal one, it's a great listen. She's kind of silly in like an endearing way, nice. And it's rad.
It's always really cool when the people that you like are actually cool people. Mm-hmm. Hey, we got to talk about this real quick. When we're talking about Nirvana and things like that, and was Kurt Cobain cool guy or was he not, whatever, Dave Grohl seems like the coolest guy ever in music, almost to a point where it's like, all right, dude, we get it. Like, we get it. You're cool. You rock. You're nice. We get it. Like, almost to the point, like, but I had to like stop myself from having that attitude about it because it'd be very easy not to. But my point was, didn't you tour with them?
Yeah, May did a tour with Nirvana. Oh, that's me projecting my own fantasies. May did a tour with Foo Fighters and Weezer,
which is just
insane. Yes. We got a call, and I think it was during it must have been like 2007 or 2006 or something. We got a call, and we got on 3 dates because how do you pronounce that band? Kasabian?
Yeah. I always thought it was Kasabian. But
they dropped off. They had something happen, and so we got 3 shows through Atlanta and Florida, and then we got 3 more out to Texas. It was your typical arena rock experience in the sense that we didn't see too much of the headliners. I saw Brian Bell walking around one time, maybe Patrick Wilson. Never saw Rivers backstage. At one point, we were walking around, and me and Dave were walking just through the backstage area, and Taylor Hawkins invited us into the dressing room. and this was like just me just on cloud nine. Obviously, Taylor Hawkins is a rad drummer.
Right.
Super cool dude. He was an accident. That's what we thought about the show. I can't speak for Dave, but I was just kind of like super nervous and trying my best not to make a fool of myself. And I never met Dave, unfortunately, but they were super cool. As a band, they were just the tour, the crew was all rad. So back to this point about Dave Grohl, and then we will get back to the Breeders. You know, he has this persona, and I think what he's done for rock music beyond the 90s is maintained a very, and been able to emphasize a very good approach to music in general that I think is not superior to other approaches, but much needed to be maintained in this environment right now.
Right.
I do think like he's Dave Grohl being Dave Grohl at this point, and you know,
I think
here's one night with you, I could go on and talk like with the idea that people listen to this, I only have positive things to say about Dave Grohl. If I wanted to be nitpicky, then I will talk to you about it on the phone one night.
my nitpicky thing that I'm not afraid to say about Dave Grohl, and I love him. I love his music. I think he's the coolest dude ever. I'd love to sit down and talk to him, and he's amazing.
Yeah.
But the one thing I would say that I've heard brought up before is that his attitude about like, dude, you just got to get out there and rock. That doesn't necessarily like always work by work, I mean, if you want to be a career musician, it doesn't, you have to like have like things like a team and a plan and some luck and whatever. And that approach doesn't always work when you weren't in Nirvana.
Yeah.
So that would be my one critical thing, I would say.
That's one thing. I mean, that's honestly what I would have said to you in a bar one night. It's just like, okay, well, it's almost anachronistic at this point because in one sense, like, if you want to be successful, it's not as romantic as that.
Right.
Yeah, I think he has the privilege of hindsight and massive success on his side, so he can speak to this experience that is his, but it's not everyone's. And like I said, I think ethically and philosophically, his voice needs to be continuously emphasized. However, in terms of the kind of experience people have these days, and music and touring, it's just not the same. You and I came up as well, like playing music professionally in the early 2000s. It was a very golden era for bands in our genre at our level because things were going really well. But that quickly ended. You know, like when 2007 and 8 and 9 came around, things kind of tapered off a little bit. So I think everything needs to be thought of in terms of when it was being said, conceptually speaking. And I think Dave Grohl's experience was a unique one, an influential one, and a positive one. But yeah, it's just not as simple as having an attitude.
Right. For sure. For sure. And what's cool is that just like you and I continually do and try to do is, maybe in the worlds of music that May and Punchline have been involved in, maybe there's been this ebb and flow and this wave where things come into style and things go out and whatever. But the important thing is to stay true to what you love, continue finding a path to continue making music and not have to stop doing that. And just like we have been part of things that have risen and fallen and come back and went out and things like that, you have to, I feel like in the same way, the Breeders, the high tide of that their world of music may have been in the 90s, but they have also had successful music careers going. They just released a new album last year. They're always going to have that between the Breeders themselves and the Pixies and things like that. They'll always have people interested in what they do. And then it's just on them to make cool music. This
band was a side project of the Pixies and Throwing Muses. To think about this band as a side project is really crazy. They're able to then record, Last Splash in '93 and make such an impact on the music scene. And I think, our our experience is limited. I would love to be able to talk with people that were around that world to speak to things that they were going through and having to deal with that we don't really have an in on. I mean, they released their last record in 2018 that said, All Nerve, which
Right.
I have not spent much time with because I think it's another whole conversation about how music means something based on when it's heard and where it's heard and how old you were or where you were.
Right.
And I think for us, seeing this video for Cannonball in 1993 and just being, for whatever reason, ways that we understood or maybe didn't understand, mesmerized and kind of floored by what we were seeing and what we were hearing. I mean, that drum beat with just like the kind of focus on the hi-hat and the hi-hat stand, that roll that goes into the chorus that's kind of like followed by the guitar kind of like scraping the strings. I don't know what you call it, like a chug, whatever. I don't know what it is. But that stuff is really rad. And I was like, those are stylistic hinge points, linchpins for a lot of bands moving forward. They were doing this stuff that was very, very influential that all came out of this era of music in the 90s. Music.
Dude, Cannonball has, since you're bringing it up, so many things that are signature. Like most songs, you're lucky if you have that one signature thing about it. But this song, it has ooh to start it out. It has that the cymbal and stand thing, the beat that you're talking about. It has the drum fill that goes into the chorus. It has the chorus itself, the very distorted, where you don't even really understand what she's saying. There's so many. One
thing that in Demons, I've from day one, I was just really into distorted everything, distorted vocals. I think that's another thing we see this happening in a mainstream sense. I should say on a song that had success in the mainstream. Like that's super cool to me. I think the guitar line, that ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, like, so that's when you hear that, you immediately know. So again, to your point, you have these moments that occur in the song. The song is only 3 minutes and 36 seconds. And it's almost like that Def Leppard song Photograph, where every part of the song is a hook. In this sense, every part of the song is something that we remember and we can see in other places after the song was released.
I mean, I didn't even say the bass line. When you're, the guitar, the bass, everything about this song is a hook. Everything about this song is oh man, what a perfect song. Kim Deal, if you're listening right now, you wrote a perfect song. And what I will say is, I don't know if Kim Deal is listening. If I were Kim Deal, if I saw there was a podcast about specifically about Cannonball, I'd probably listen to it. But Kim Deal, here's what I want to say. And Zach, I'll give you a chance to say something to Kim Deal too if you have something to say. But here's what I would say. Hey, I was a young kid when this came out. I was not like a college age person or like a person who I didn't even know who the Pixies were.
Yeah.
And this song came out and I loved it and instantly bought the CD. It was a buzz clip at the time on MTV. I believe it like the same time as like Linger and I think maybe Loser. Or I don't know. I just grouped those songs together and those are amazing songs too that we could talk about some other time. But you made something that in my my opinion is better than anything the Pixies did. I like the Pixies too, but like this is the one of the greatest songs of the 90s. We always talk on this podcast about whether the song was a one-hit blunder, meaning it was a one-hit wonder and that whoever that artist was shouldn't have had anything, which I would put like I would put like Aqua and Tom Cochrane in that and stuff like that. But or is it One Hit Thunder, which is the name of the podcast? I would say this song is about as one hit thunder as it gets, and I'm sure that you would agree.
Yeah, honestly, building on what you just said, I agree with everything. And we talk about the song as being that's on the podcast as a one-hit wonder, but and I think I can speak for Chris and I both. It's not a one-hit anything. It's something that's kind of we heard once, and we kept the feeling the song gave us was something we kept chasing ever since we heard songs like Cannonball and Like It, and songs like it that came out in the 90s. And it's one of the reasons why we do, or have done our best to build a life that revolves around music in some sense. Songs like these, when we hear songs like Cannonball that we hear when we're 8th graders, doing this awesome stuff we don't understand, but we get at the same time. So yeah, you wrote a great song. Everyone in the band at the time wrote a great song. Hats off, Kim Deal and the Breeders.
Hell yeah. You come back around all these years later, I come back around and I think I like the song even more. Yeah. Like, it's like having a conversation with this about the intricacies of the song makes me respect and love it even more. The album Last Splash is awesome. And I don't know.
Well, I'm going to go listen to the song again now.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah. Cool. Well, it's nice talking to you, Zach.
So much fun, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
When it gets hard, maybe I know where you are.
This has been One Hit Thunder. One Hit Thunder is produced by Matt Kelly as part of the Geekscape Network and hosted by Chris Fafalios of the bands Punchline, Peck, and Another Cheetah. You can hear the Punchline song Darkest Dark off their album Lion playing underneath me right now. Punchline will be playing Anti-Fest on March 28th in Pittsburgh, featuring Anti-Flag, Suicide Machines, and many other great bands. Visit punchline.com for tickets, as well as news, merch, and other upcoming tour dates. Special thanks to our guest Zach of the bands Demons and May. Demons' new record will be out this summer under Spartan Records. Check out their music on Spotify and follow them on Instagram, Demons Band. Also, May just announced 2 shows with One Hit Thunder friends and hopeful future guests, Juliana Theory, at the Music Hall of Williamsburg in Brooklyn on June 13th and the Roxy in Hollywood on June 27th. Tickets are now available on May's Instagram. Let us know your thoughts on the show by emailing us at onehitthunderpodcast@gmail.com or contacting us on all of our social media linked in the show notes. And be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting apps. We'll be back next week with another episode of One Hit Thunder.
When life gets so bleak and scary, this Polaroid will be necessary. When it gets hard, maybe I know where you are. Even in the darkest dark, I'm there with you. I'm there with you. I'm there with you.
You're listening to the Geekscape Network.
Hey there, I am Johnny Christ from Avenged Sevenfold, and I've got a podcast called Drinks with Johnny you're going to want to check out. I sit down with a bunch of different people from all different walks of life, from professional wrestlers to actors, comedians, fighters, musicians, everything in between. I'm just looking to make some friends and have a good time doing it. So if that sounds like something you're into, go check out Drinks with Johnny, streaming everywhere now.
Hi, this is Krista Makes, host of Krista Makes a Podcast. The theme of the podcast is songwriting. Each week, my musical guest picks a defining song from their career to discuss, critique, and analyze during the show. So please join me for some fun and insight into some of the greatest songs ever written and recorded. Listen and subscribe at soundtalentmedia.com.